the approach I'm going to take is to assume that the social sciences as we know them, that's economics, philosophy, sociology, and so on, are an ideology which has been generated and developed mainly in Western Europe and America over the last 300 years. It's no different from any other ideology. It's a set of ideas about causation, about time, about space, about the purpose of life, about why things change. So it is like any other ideology. Another way of describing it rather than the word ideology is to say that it's a set of paradigms. Now, I've put the classical book by Thomas Kuhn. I'll try and write up people's names. K-U-H-N. Thomas Kuhn wrote a famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Do any of you know that book? A few. Not many. Well, it's a nice book. It caused a great stir in the 70s, partly because it was so short, about 100 pages, and secondly, it had a very simple idea, which I can luckily, therefore, tell you in 1 minute. The idea was that instead of science being the progress of truth, from a lesser truth to a greater truth, science was just a belief system which kept shifting. And he used the word paradigm. As people pointed out later, he used it in 37 different ways and therefore got us all confused, which also added to the popularity of the book because, as you know, if you can make people confused, they read your books carefully, backwards and forwards. Anyway, the central meaning of paradigm, perhaps I better spell it, was a set of interlocking ideas which define both the questions for the social sciences and also the kind of answer which are acceptable. As you know, you always have to ask, well, what would be a good answer to this question? And so Kuhn looked at the great shifts, and he concentrated, being an expert on the 17th century scientific revolution, he particularly concentrated on Galileo and that period. And he asked the question, what happened that Galileo, watching the pendulum swinging, suddenly saw it in a new way? This is the question. Why do suddenly what Einstein described as the rape of the mind, when suddenly the blinding vision, the eureka syndrome, suddenly you see the world in a new way? What happened in the eagle, the far left right-hand table in 1957 when Crick and Watson and others discovered or solved the problem of DNA. How does that happen? And what's it about? So Kuhn argued that it was about, not because the scientists were cleverer or better or even got closer to the truth. There just was a huge shift in the paradigm, the high level which dictates the models in different disciplines. So a paradigm shift would be something like the movement from functionalism to structuralism or to postmodernism. And Kuhn looked at how this seemed to happen to a certain extent in the social sciences. Another person who does the same sort of thing using another word is, of course, Foucault. And he uses the word episteme. I probably should have put that on the reading list. Note it down, someone. Epistemology is the study or science of knowing, how you know things for certain. And an episteme is a system of knowing. And in his work, particularly the archaeology of knowledge, he says that there's a great shift between what he calls the classical and the modern episteme, sometime in the 17th, 18th centuries. I don't think he's right either about the shift. And he's certainly totally disinterested, as he says himself, in why it happened. He says this isn't the kind of question you can ask about why you get a shift such as this. It's too difficult. He renounces the task of trying to understand why it happened. And so does Kuhn. If you read the introduction to structure of scientific revolutions, you find that he says, it's not my job to explain why Galileo saw the world in a different way. He just did. And my job is to show that that's how science progresses by in his famous theory, the old men die off, the young Turks come up, and a new paradigm is founded. It's not through rational reasoning. It's just through a change of a feeling about what are the interesting questions. But Kuhn doesn't try and solve the question of how this happened, nor does Foucault. And in fact, most postmodernists would think it was a ridiculous kind of question because it's so large and wide. But it's one that I was brought up to ask, and I find it interesting. In other words, why does the scientific revolution occur? Why does the Renaissance occur? Why does functionalism give way to structuralism? So these are questions which I like to ask, even if they are unanswerable.